You're live.
So we're live now, so I'm going to start the meeting. Welcome, everybody. My name is Alan Freeman. I am moderating this meeting on defending the Bolivarian Revolution. And this is organized by the International Manifesto Group, with profuse thanks to our co-sponsors, Venezuela Solidarity Campaign, Orinoco Tribune, Black Liberation Alliance, Friends of Socialist China. Yeah, hi, somebody's interrupting. Bolivarian Revolution. No, it's just a screen. And Constitution News. And we will hear from delegates on the recent inauguration of President Nicolás Maduro as President of America. A few introductory remarks. The Bolivarian Revolution marches forward, and it has made impressive progress in poverty alleviation, food sovereignty, social housing, and economic growth, working closely with China, Russia, Iran, Nicaragua, and other countries towards a multipolar system of international relations based on sovereignty, non-interference, and the principles of the UN Charter. However, the US has been stepping up regime change efforts in Venezuela. Under Biden, it recognized failed opposition candidate Edmundo González as president and placed a $25 million bounty on the head of President Nicolás Maduro. We have 7 very well-informed speakers, and I'll confine myself for that reason to a couple of background points. The first concerns the legitimacy of Maduro's election, on which we and our partners have held several webinars, 2 of which I'm going to put in the chat. And as you will see, and as you will know if you saw them, there was a systematic attempt during the election not merely to discredit a process renowned for its democratic character, but to use this as the occasion for a coup. This coup failed, and this is the background to the renewed US offensive. In preparation, the US and its allies, as normal, have engaged in a systematic campaign of distortion, and this is well answered in the webinars I refer you to. I urge you to consult them if you haven't yet, and to share them, because these campaigns are very pernicious and have the aim of both lining up liberal so-called opinion in the West and vacillators in Latin America itself. The second point, and this is very exciting, is the upcoming visit of 2 people. Marco Rubio, Trump's new head of state, has gone to Panama, and Trump's envoy for special missions, Richard Grenell, has gone to Venezuela itself, where he has just met with President Maduro, on which we hopefully will hear from our presenters. Now, Rubio has recently published on the State Department website a rambling interview with Megan Ryan, in which, among other things, he declares that the unipolar moment is over and that contentious matters should be settled by diplomacy. The problem is what the administration means by diplomacy. Rubio's own account of his purpose makes interesting reading. Quote, mass migration, drugs, and hostile policies pursued by Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela have wreaked havoc, he says. All the while, the Chinese Communist Party uses diplomatic and economic leverage, such as the Panama Canal, to oppose the US and turn sovereign nations into vassal states. Now, as to Panama, Trump, as we know, has simply declared his intention to re-annex it. If the bounty on Maduro's head is any indication of what diplomacy still means, the world had better watch out. Nor has there been any let-up under Trump so far, just an amplification of the illegal and inhuman sanctionings, and a rescinding of even minor Biden-era oil import concessions. The explicit coupling of 3 of Latin America's most revolutionary governments to Trump's attack on China should make us fully aware that in the USA's backyard, there will be no let-up in the assault on Latin America's people. So I'm going to hand over to our speakers now. Before I do that, just to point out, we have 7 excellent speakers. This means we're going to be quite tight, so I'm going to try and discipline them insofar as that's possible to 10 minutes each, and that will leave time for Q&A. When we come to the Q&A, help us by, if you can, putting some comments in the chat, and we'll be asking my co-organizers to try and assemble those comments. But you're also just simply welcome to use the tools, the reaction buttons on your screen, to stick your hand up, and I'll try as far as I can to take questions in the order in which I see hands go up. I'll take 3 questions at a time, and then we'll ask the speakers to respond so that we get a bit of a debate going. So without more ado, I'm going to start with our first speaker, Maria Paez Victor. She is a sociologist, born in Venezuela and educated in Caracas, New York, Mexico City, England, and Canada. For several years, she taught the sociology of health and medicine, as well as health and environmental policies at the University of Toronto. She has national and international experience in policy analysis and impact assessment, with expertise in the areas of health, environment, and energy. So I'd like to welcome Maria Paez Victor.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you and the organizers of this wonderful webinar to defend the Bolivarian Revolution of Venezuela. I will not touch upon the recent elections or the inauguration. I will leave that to the other panelists. I will just shortly say Nicolás Maduro won the elections fair and square with 52% of the votes. That's about 6 million votes, a fact that was witnessed and backed by the election authorities and by the Supreme Court of the land and by hundreds of independent observers. By the way, Trump won with only 49% of the votes. I will let the election observers on the panel talk about this experience. But this I will say, the enemies of the Bolivarian Revolution, both domestic and international, especially the US empire, have built up a campaign to malign the elections in order to bolster the idea of a coup and invasion, as Alan has just said. I pay no heed to them. They have presented no evidence whatsoever about fraud, even though the authorities have asked them for it. This was the 30th election in Venezuela in the last 25 years. The Venezuelan people love to vote and also are keen to protest and protect their rights. So if there was any doubt in anybody's mind that Nicolás Maduro had not won the elections, how come the people are not out on the street protesting? Why? Because they know Nicolás Maduro won. Now, Venezuela has the misfortune of having the largest oil reserve in the world, which the United States covets. As Hugo Chavez advanced the Bolivarian Revolution, it became clear that undeniable advances were being made in the economic development of Venezuela that were evident in substantial improvements to the life of Venezuelans. It established free medical services in towns, villages, neighborhoods. Schools at every level were built. Food access was plentiful. Jobs were created. Poverty was reduced drastically, as well as inequality. The infrastructure was improved and built. In summary, the Bolivarian had become that rare thing, a rich socialist revolution, with the funds to transform and create economic and social development. Just think, when Russia did its revolution, they were broke. When Cuba started its revolution, they were broke. Well, Venezuela was not broke. And the Western capitalist nations, instead of lauding these accomplishments that had reduced poverty and misery, reviled it. It was a bad example. Anything that smacked of socialism had to be stopped on its tracks. They willfully ignored the progressive constitution and all the legal and policy implementations of human rights for women, children, indigenous peoples, the handicapped, and the environment. They blocked everything of this nature with the lie that Venezuela had become a dictatorship, despite the elections, of course, and presented no evidence to substantiate these claims, vilifying President Maduro as a dictator. All the participatory democratic innovations that we should really talk about that Venezuela has developed were willfully ignored and twistingly interpreted. Therefore, under the false excuses about defending democracy, the US imposed illegal economic sanctions and an economic and financial blockade that are far-reaching, malicious, and a crime against humanity, as UN human rights raconteurs have decried, both Alina Duhan and Alfred Desaya. The aim was to destroy all the advances of the Bolivarian Revolution to impoverish the population and bring down the legitimate government. It was a vile siege, like in medieval times, counting on the suffering of the population to turn on its government. Since 2015, more than 1,000 illegal sanctions thrust upon Venezuela by the USA, followed by its minions, Canada and the EU. It was barred from the international financial system, denied SWIFT, and I am going to repeat this because this is astonishing. Look at what they've robbed of Venezuela. All its assets in foreign banks, 7 million. Its assets in the IMF, 5 billion. The Citgo Oil Company, 10 billion. 31 tons of gold in the Bank of England stolen, 2 billion. It was prevented from buying and selling on the international market. Couldn't produce or sell its oil, could not buy food or medicine. And immorally, this I want everyone to remember, during a pandemic, COVID vaccines were denied Venezuela. Now, this is an astonishing statistics, but it's true. The government's income was reduced by 95%, and Venezuela's GDP suffered the greatest drop by any country, even in wartime. In the last 7 years, the blockade and the sanctions have cost the nation a total of 642 billion. And this is worse than all of that. 100,000 Venezuelans have died as a direct result of the inhuman US sanctions, fully backed by Canada and the EU. This was a catastrophic situation, driving many to leave the country, about 2 million. Yet, amazingly, the economy did not collapse. There was no famine. The government did not fall. The sanctions failed to reach its goal. It's astonishing, unheard of in any nation, that a country so hammered economically with illegal sanctions, which reduced the income by 95%, produced losses to its economy, has not collapsed, as the Western media predicted over and over. This remarkable strength in face of adversity is a testament to the social and political cohesion of Venezuela and its Bolivarian transformation. During these years of economic blockade, there has been no famine in Venezuela, no civil war, no chaos, no breaking of social order. And one of the most remarkable events was during the pandemic, when the Western nations refused to allow Venezuela to buy their vaccines. Nevertheless, Venezuela had the lowest death rates in the entire continent. Thanks to China, Russia, Cuba, Venezuela managed to finally get vaccines. And more importantly, thousands of grassroots organizations helped the public health authorities to teach the population about disease and promote masks and social distancing and testing. Nobody was complaining this was impediment against their freedom, but as an exercise in caring for themselves and one's neighbor. Today, 2025, Venezuela has risen from the ashes like the phoenix. The government of Venezuela, led by Maduro, looked at its resources and alternatives. It developed strategies to diversify the economy, promote its agriculture and grow food, export other natural resources, promote domestic manufacturing and commerce, and open other international markets for its products. Today, for example, it builds computers, cars, drones, even planes. It was helped by the solidarity and support it received in aids and loans from allies such as China, Russia, India, Iran, Cuba, and many others. It survived and it eliminated hyperinflation. But it's important to underline that the government was joined in this patriotic economic endeavor by millions of Venezuelans, organized in many grassroots organizations, including commune, which had a key role, and unions as well as private enterprise that help withstand the sanctions. Okay, what are the results? The result is that Venezuela now has the fastest growing GDP in the region, according to not the Bolivarian government, but Credit Suisse. And it's at 9% a year, rising, exceeding even the government's expectations. Venezuela is now virtually self-sufficient in food. It delivered, in 2024 alone, 132 million food boxes. It has built 5 million housing units in the past 7 years. I underline this especially for all of us Canadians out there that we can't seem to build one house. Venezuela looked at the wide world beyond the United States, which had been practically its only oil buyer in the past, and survived. The USA, Canada, and their allies failed to isolate it diplomatically or economically, and its population, according to consistent polls, has a positive, optimistic outlook of their future. So from the ashes of an economy that is more, the economy is now more sustainable and diversified, and a society that is more cohesive and viable. It is evident. Now, even the private sector, which used to be, number one conspirators, now even Fidecámaras and other chambers of commerce have accepted the government and renounced violence. Now, this new era of the Bolivarian Revolution that has brought about substantial social cohesion is due in great part to the fact that the government, with whatever meager resources it had, it dedicated all it could to the social security of its people. It's very hard, if not impossible, to successfully carry out a coup d'etat against a highly popular government that is taking care of you. With great personal and public sacrifices, the government of Nicolás Maduro dedicated a great majority of resources it had on hand for what Venezuelans called la deuda social, that is, the social debt. That is for the urgent necessities of the people, a people that during 40 years before the revolution was practically marginalized, excluded from the petroleum riches and benefits. For example, today, the budget for the government for 2025 dedicates 77.6% of it to social investment. Today, Venezuela is self-sufficient in food, has a diversified economy, has the highest GDP growth in Latin America, produces 1 million barrels of oil a day, and sells to a host of international markets. And it's not just selling oil, but selling all sorts of products, agricultural, mineral, and manufactured. And Venezuela got rid of hyperinflation. Now, this is important. An important characteristic of the social security system of Venezuela is due, in fact, to its historic roots as well as its socialist vision.
You will need to come to a close soon.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Maria.
The funds for the public services are not classified like costs, like in capitalist countries, but is social investment. And this is really important because Venezuela has turned upside down this stigma of poverty, which in capitalist countries, people are blamed individually for their poverty and not the structural stuff. So now in Venezuela, people understand that the government and the society owes the people. It's a stroke of genius to combat the stigma of inequality and of poverty. I could go on about the right-wing movements in Europe and the United States, but I just want to say that it will be Venezuela and countries like Venezuela that embrace a socialist programs who will be the ones who will be in less conflict in the coming years. And Venezuela's Bolivarian Revolution is the shining example for the world to see and learn from. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. And I'm so sorry to have to cut you off, especially since you never managed to get to saying this interesting meeting which has taken place between Granel and Maduro. But I'm sure the other speakers will deal with that. And if not, I'm going to ask you about it when we come to the Q&A. So
Okay.
I now want to introduce Camila Escalante, who is a journalist who has recently traveled to Venezuela, a correspondent for Press TV, and the editor of the online outlet Causachun News, which I hope I pronounced correctly. Camila, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Alan, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak. As you may know, I've spent a bit of time in Venezuela over the past 7 years, and I've witnessed the importance of the Bolivarian Revolution for the progress of the country and its people, and the influence of the Bolivarian Revolution that it's had on the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean. Under the leadership of Commander Hugo Chavez, followed by the leadership of President Nicolás Maduro, countries and peoples of our region have benefited from cooperation initiatives with Venezuela, which, despite the all-out economic war, has shared its resources with its neighbors. And over the last 26 years, Caracas became one of the most important meeting places for political parties and people's movements of Latin America and the Caribbean and world. And tomorrow, we are commemorating 26 years since Commander Chavez first took office on February 2nd, 1999, beginning this process. Last year, we saw the launch of the Anti-Fascist International, a creation of President Nicolás Maduro, which is a direct response to the problems we're confronting today all around the world. Now we're seeing the importance of Venezuela not only for its own people's advancement and for the step forward we've taken in establishing socialism on our continent, but Venezuela now is a symbol of the fight against international fascism, and since 2024 is one of the bases from which we're directly confronting this phenomenon. So I too, like Maria, I'm not going to speak about the meeting yesterday, nor the elections, because I know we have other speakers who observed the elections, such as Arnold August, my Canadian colleague. But I think it's very important to give emphasis to this process of the forming of the Anti-Fascist International, which was the idea of President Nicolás Maduro and comes from Venezuela, because it's very important at this time. And we have to understand Venezuela not only as a lighthouse or an example for the region, but now for the entire world, given what we're experiencing and living through now. So some of the other speakers may also mention that Caracas hosted the International Anti-Fascist World Festival a couple weeks ago, January 9th through the 11th, with the participation of about 2,000 delegates from all continents who traveled to Venezuela with the purpose of uniting against fascism and to plan the strategic defeat of fascism. This process is a silver lining in this moment in the global class struggle. This meeting had a final resolution in which they stated the following purposes. They said that this international anti-fascist Congress will continue to advance in the organization and consolidation of chapters of the Anti-Fascist International in each country, region, continent, creating a global platform for the struggle against fascism with an executive secretariat, and it will create and launch a think tank of the Anti-Fascist International called Caracas Forum to establish spaces for strategic analysis and anti-fascist praxis in each country, region, and continent. Is proposed to convene a major world meeting of think tanks. And they also propose in the final declaration a training camp for youth comrades committed to the building of a new world. They proposed including the religious sector, which is very important for Latin America, because Latin America, which has in many countries a strong tendency to have people who are followers of Christian faith, both Catholic and evangelical and otherwise, are not going to leave the Christian faith overnight. And so it's very important that any revolutionary process include those people who are followers of that faith. This Anti-Fascist International also proposed in its final declaration a international meeting of political training schools, a World Anti-Fascist Congress of Indigenous Peoples, many of whom already participated in some of the congresses and meetings in the last year, and a meeting of jurists against fascism. And I want to talk a little bit about what qualifies Venezuela to lead this process against fascism and its experience it's had with confronting fascism in the country. Venezuela has itself confronted the ideology of hate as espoused by the far right in the country, the far right opposition, which has refused to accept many of the many of the elections that have taken place in the country over the past 2 decades. That opposition promoted, financed, organized, and unleashed violence in the form of what we call guarimbas, but also in the form of false flag attacks, even at times harming their own people, their own followers in the streets, and also targeting, in general, the general population of Venezuela. Among the most gruesome and vile acts of terror, as many people know, has been the hanging of thin wire across streets in Caracas to slit the throats of motorcyclists when motorcycles are a main source of transportation in that city and in the country. I interviewed about a week ago in Caracas a young political analyst named Annalise Blanco, and she told me that the Bolivarian ideology cannot consent or cannot afford the luxury of retreating in the face of these conditions of fascism. She said here in Venezuela, things were achieved like never before with the Bolivarian Revolution, such as the recognition of women and the corresponding ministry, such as the ministries that deal with the issues of indigenous peoples and helping with the inclusion of people living with disabilities and illness. And this is a country and a government which has found successes in doing so despite the economic war that persists against the country. And that this is a country that is focused on inclusion and empowerment. Now I'm summarizing what she said. In contrast with the governments, such as the government of Javier Milei in Argentina, which is adopting and following the sort of lead that's being put forth by the United States, and which, you know, the countries such as Argentina, such as Ecuador under Daniel Noboa are becoming countries of exclusion where people are being increasingly disenfranchised. Venezuela has also taken the lead on many important key world issues in the last few years. Venezuela was among the very first and the loudest to state its position in solidarity with the people of Russia and the government in its efforts to try to bring to an end the Nazism and extremism found in Ukraine. Venezuela also has taken a very important stand against the Zionist entity and the terrorism it unleashes on the people of Gaza and the ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people, and has also warned of Zionism's threats against the rest of the world and its immediate region, which attacks, obviously, the people of Lebanon, Iran, Syria, and elsewhere. It's noteworthy that the Venezuelan far-right opposition, in the wake of everything that has transpired in the collapse of the former government of Syria, the Venezuelan opposition has called for that sort of fate to take place in Venezuela as well. They want to see what has happened to Gaddafi happen to President Nicolás Maduro. And they do so knowing that something like that would cause a civil war in the country. Venezuela has also stood time and time again with all of the other countries which are facing economic warfare, such as Iran, Zimbabwe, North Korea, and others who are the target of unilateral coercive measures, just like our Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela itself. So for these reasons and a whole lot of others, it's very it makes the most sense that Venezuela is leading this very important process to deal a defeat to international fascism, once and for all. It's the very beginning of a process, one that began with a Congress in September of 2024, but for that reason, the Bolivarian Revolution now stands for more than just all of the different works and achievements of the last 26 years within the country, which has helped, like I said, bring about social inclusion and, a sort of semi-participatory democracy within the country. But also now Venezuela is once again lending itself to the peoples of the world in the different struggles that we're fighting right now to confront the new times. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Camila. And I think that the report on the formation of the Anti-Fascist International is something that all of us feel is very inspiring and especially important at this time. And I hope that everybody will do whatever they can, including thinking about the idea of local chapters, to make sure that this initiative is as well known as possible. So I'm now going to take Dan Kavalik, and Dan graduated from Columbia Law School in '93. He currently teaches international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He wrote Nicaragua, A History of U.S. Intervention and Resistance in 2023, and The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela, which includes a foreword by Oliver Stone in 2019. He served as in-house counsel for the United Steelworkers for 26 years. He has been traveling to Nicaragua since 1987 and has been a friend of Nicaragua and the Sandinista revolution since then. He writes extensively on human rights, international human rights, and US foreign policy for the Huffington Post, Counterpunch, and RT News, and has lectured throughout the world on these subjects. So, Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I just returned from Syria last night, so forgive me if I'm not on the top of my game. But I'm thinking about Venezuela. I want to talk a bit about Venezuela through the lens of Syria, because what we saw in Syria, what we're seeing now, is the result of years of draconian sanctions by the West against Syria, and also a war, by the way, a very brutal war, of course, that the West brought to Syria, which, thank goodness, Venezuela has not had to endure. But in the end, the war was not, had not been a real big factor in Syria since 2020, because they had reached an agreement to basically cease hostilities between essentially these terrorist groups and the government in Damascus. But the last 4 years, the sanctions, which have continued there, they're what are called the Caesar sanctions, really paved the way for what happened about a month ago, where you had this group called HTS, which is basically Al-Qaeda, take over Syria. And that is exactly the type of thing they want to do to Venezuela. That is what the sanctions are intended to do in Venezuela. And the sanctions against Venezuela have been just as brutal against that country as the sanctions against Syria. It must be noted that it was Trump that imposed really the worst of the sanctions, I believe, back in 2017. Which at that time brought revenue in Venezuela to almost nothing. I mean, really, there was a moment where it was bringing in no money, in which it was having difficulty feeding its people, getting medicine for its people. Maria Victor at the beginning, who gave a great introduction, mentioned the figure, I believe, of 100,000 Venezuelans dying due to sanctions. Well, that was a figure that Alfred de Zayas, the UN expert, had given, I think, in around 2019. He thought about 100,000 people had died up to that point due to the sanctions. Well, many more died after 2019. So I think 100,000 is probably a low estimate of the people who died due to the lack of medicines, life-saving medicines. And again, that 2019 figure, which de Zayas gave, was before COVID, right? So think of all the people who may have died due to COVID because they could not get the COVID vaccine, as Maria pointed out. They couldn't even get masks or other protective gear that they needed because of the sanctions. So certainly many, many tens of thousands of Venezuelans died due to the sanctions. And as Maria pointed out, the U.S. stole Venezuela's single largest source of revenue, which was its U.S.-based petroleum company, Citgo. And right now, Citgo, as far as I know, is being sold off in pieces. That was the plan anyway, and a federal court greenlit that. And so Venezuela may never get that back, you know, a huge source of revenue, which brought in billions of dollars for Venezuela. So the fact that Venezuela is still standing, is able to feed its people, able to provide health care, able to build these 5 million homes that Maria pointed out, is really nothing short of miraculous. Again, especially when you see what happened to Syria. And again, I just returned from Syria, and it is still, you know, whole cities are still rubble because the U.S. never allowed Syria to reconstruct from that war. And again, that is what allowed the regime change to happen there. And so, by the way, one of our talking points always used to be that, oh, well, sanctions don't really do what they're intended to do anyway, and that is cause regime change. I think in the case of Syria, it really did do that. And so, you know, we really have our work cut out for us. As I mentioned, it was Trump that imposed those Caesar sanctions. It was Trump that recognized Juan Guaido as the fraudulent president of Venezuela, which it turns out was nothing merely but a ploy to have a conduit in Guaido to give all these billions of dollars that the U.S. was withholding and stealing from Venezuela. God knows where all that money is now, right? And now, of course, Biden recognized Edmundo González as the president of Venezuela. We'll see how that turns out. But I think the main takeaway is that the Venezuelan revolution continues. It is strong. Why I did not make it there for the inauguration, I saw that, you know, the videos of the opposition protest were tiny. Meanwhile, you had huge numbers of people who did turn out to support Nicolás Maduro. And I think those, you know, on this webinar who've been to Venezuela before also know that, you know, the truth is you can tell a Maduro rally from an opposition rally. And that is because it's largely brown people who come to the Maduro rallies. And it's usually, you know, the whiter, blue-eyed people who go to the opposition rallies. And that's because the Nicolás Maduro, the Chavista Nicolás Maduro governments have supported the rights of Afro-Venezuelans, of indigenous peoples, in a way they've never been supported before, and indeed never been recognized before. These have been invisible people prior to Chavez, and they have been put forward by the revolution, which really should be a reason that, you know, progressive people in the United States should support Venezuela. And I don't think they've gotten the support from progressives that they deserve. And so it's a testament to Maduro that he continues to have his support from the working and poor people, from Afro-Venezuelans, from indigenous peoples, and that is the heart of the revolution. Obviously, the task before us is to continue to support Venezuela in resisting the sanctions and resisting what I think will be, under Trump and Marco Rubio, a much more aggressive foreign policy towards Venezuela, foreign policy that will be designed to try to upend Venezuela and turn Venezuela into another Syria. So those are my brief remarks. Unfortunately, I cannot stay for the Q&A. As I said, I just got back from Syria last night and I have some things to take care of here, but I appreciate you all being on this call today, and I hope you find my remarks helpful. in some regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dan. I think that order of heroism for attending after this blitzing travel you must have had from Syria and the time you spent there, which I'm sure was greatly appreciated. And I'm sure at some future time we'll be hearing from you about what happened there when you were visiting. That would be very useful. So I'm now going to ask Jesus Rodriguez Espinosa. And he is an expert in Venezuelan relations, in international relations, Venezuelan politics, and media and communication. He served for several years as Consul General of Venezuela in Chicago. And before that, he was part of the foundational editorial teams of the Venezuelan online media team, Aporrea. He is the founder and editor of the Venezuelan anti-imperialist news outlook, Orinoco Tribune. Welcome, Jesus.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you to the International Manifesto Group for the invitation. Do you hear me well? Okay, great. I want to mention, what I want to do in my 10 minutes right now is talk a little bit about the January 10, about the President Maduro's inauguration. And what I want to say is that despite the undisputable victory of Nicolás Maduro in the July 28 elections, and despite our criticisms about some mistakes that we see on the side of the National Electoral Council leadership, it is unquestionable that the latest imperialist threat against Chavismo was defeated again in January. I'm talking about during the Maduro's inauguration. And I believe that it's important to remark 3 scenarios that we Chavista envision aiming at Nicolás Maduro's inauguration. And those 3 scenarios, maybe there might be more scenarios, but the ones that we envision were the threat of terrorist attacks the weeks before Maduro's inauguration. That was something that was there. Another scenario was the real possibility of a circus during or close to January 10, the day of Maduro's inauguration, meaning mostly a fake inauguration or an illegal entry into Venezuela of Edmundo González, the candidate of the far-right opposition. And the third scenario was the possibility of terrorist attacks after Maduro's inauguration, take into consideration that many far-right Venezuelans that, of course, are controlled by Washington were dreaming on a fast military response after Trump's inauguration if violence or unrest was unraveled in Venezuela due to these terrorist attacks that I'm talking about. So at least from our perspective in Orinoco Tribune, those were the main threats that we Chavista envisioned in front of Nicolás Maduro inauguration. And it is unquestionable at this point that those threats were defeated again. I'm not saying that those threats are not there anymore. I believe that that the threat is going to be there until imperialism is alive in the U.S. And that's why we expect you, Compass in the North, to do something about. But at least this last skirmish was defeated again by Chavismo. And I'm proud of that. And I believe that the main achievement that somehow back this recent victory is the impressive preventive intelligence from the Venezuelan side, allowing the capture of more than 125 terrorists from, I believe that more than 25 nationalities were those terrorists came from more than 25 countries. So that's something important to highlight. And those terrorists were captured from September until January this year, early January this year. Another important decision or measure taken by Venezuelan authorities was the preventive and tight control of the border to avoid the entry of Edmundo González into Venezuela because of that scenario that was created by the right-wingers about, Edmundo González entering Venezuela and proclaiming himself, like Guaidó did in 2019, the new U.S. fake president of Venezuela. So because of that amazing preventive and tight border control that was never seen in Venezuela before, at least from what I remember, that scenario was, crashed. And the other important thing that I recognize that Venezuelan authorities did was, again, active intelligence and preventive measures that disallow disorders and street violence during January 10. I mean, the day Nicolás Maduro's inauguration and the day before when the opposition held a demonstration that, again, was a very small demonstration that shows how low support they have, at least in the streets of Venezuela. And that active intelligence somehow help show the country the lack of support of the far-right opposition, but also neutralize those scenarios of street violence that were built around or before Nicolás Maduro inauguration. And another important decision or measure taken by the government was a few days ago when the Venezuelan army, the Bolivarian National Armed Force, launched the Bolivarian Shield military drill, yes, almost simultaneously with Donald Trump's inauguration. And that, in my opinion, was not was something premeditated, was something that was planned, yes, thinking in that scenario that was also envisioned by many about, right-wingers also trying to create violence in Venezuela that somehow push Donald Trump's hours after inauguration to launch a fast military action against Venezuela or something like that. So I believe that that those decisions are things that needs to be addressed. It's important also to say that that military drill was somehow aligned with a military drill what was launched like 2 days ago in the border with Colombia, where there is also an important threat caused by this violence that is happening right now in the Catatumbo region of Colombia. And that, according to what many Chavistas say, it's also might be somehow connected to right-wingers from Colombia trying to use that as an excuse to promote violence in Venezuela. But again, Venezuela intelligence was very active, and even before the explosion of this terrible crisis of violence in the Catatumbo region of Colombia, Venezuela already had more than 2,000 troops deployed in the area, precisely to try to counter any possible threats coming from Colombia, because as many of you know, Colombia has been for years the base of many right-wingers trying to promote violence and launch terrorist actions against Venezuela and Chavismo. So that's what I wanted to highlight in my words. I'm pretty sure that there will be more questions, and I will happy to answer the questions in the question and answer session. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. Am I unmuted? Yes, thank you so much. Very insightful as always. And now I'm moving to Francisco Dominguez from the UK. He is a specialist on Latin America's contemporary political economy, about which he's published extensively. He is a former refugee from Chile's Pinochet, and he is also National Secretary of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign in the UK. He is also involved in solidarity activities with Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, and Mexico. He makes regular contributions to various alternative media. He is the co-author of Right-Wing Politics in the New Latin America and author of the pamphlet Maduro, a decade continuing Chavez's socialist anti-imperialist struggle. So I'm very happy to welcome Francisco again. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Alan. And, I'm very happy that the Manifesto Group, the International Manifesto Group, has organized this very important and timely meeting. What I want to do is to look at what is posed in the current situation for Venezuela from the election and after the election, which I think Jesus touched a little bit. First of all, I was an international observer there. We managed to get a very nice, strong delegation of 9 people, which, was quite good. We nearly traveled together the whole trajectory. Certainly, all of us went together from Madrid all the way to Caracas. And that particular plane was full of people who went to the meeting to support the Venezuelan Revolution, which is, we managed to actually contact and talk to people from all over the place, particularly Europe, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and so on. As we were going down there, the media internationally, and certainly in the UK, was announcing serious troubles. It was announcing massive explosions of violence. It was announcing that because they claimed to have won the election, then they were not going to accept the inauguration of President Maduro, which he went to. And this is typical of the opposition. What they have done in the past, always, no exception. In every election that they lose, they claim fraud, but they never, ever, ever, so far, we're talking about 25 years of it, never ever actually present any evidence or any formal complaint or they don't lodge any formal reason, say, in this particular area, in this particular municipality, this particular, polling stations, polling center, and so on, this is what happened, and we have the evidence. Never, ever, not once. So they did exactly the same again. And as the results were coming through on the day, I remember, as the results were coming through on the 28th of July, by about 11:30 in the evening, Maria Corina Machado appeared on national television in several of the private national television to announce that she was not accepting the results. And she claimed that they won by 70 against 30%. And then we know the rest of it. So I think what was going on really, if you take into account the cyber attacks and the 2 days of violence, which was unleashed immediately after they lost the election, which was part of the plan, I think the real plan was in cahoot with the United States. And the plan was to actually carry out a coup d'etat. And the premise for a successful coup d'etat, or certainly to get massive support for a coup d'etat, and also international support, would have been no results. The cyber attacks were aimed to ensure that there was no results whatsoever. Thankfully, the National Electoral Council, not that I know too much about this technology part of it, they have sufficient information and sufficient strength and sufficient guards and firewalls of every kind. I heard one of the people who were speaking on national television saying that the cyber attack had managed to destroy one of the firewalls out of 15. So that gives you an idea of how well protected it was. And that's what delayed the whole results. By the 29th, the day after, it was totally clear that although there was violence, this was not on the scale, not on the intensity as previous guarimbas in Venezuela, especially if one remembers 2014 and 2017 when they lasted several months. And this was not like that. I have the strong impression, and this is my purely subjective impression, that I think the National Guard this time was slightly rougher than normally they have been with opposition rioters. So this meant the total failure of the opposition. And I think the reason why the United States came to these, to involve itself in this effort to overthrow violently the government of Venezuela was because of the success. I mean, it's, Maria has already said it very eloquently. How is it possible that a country that loses 99% of its revenues from abroad in hard currency is able not only to survive, is not only able to survive in the middle of the pandemic, but not only that, is able to actually recover massively? The vigorous recovery, economic recovery of Venezuela is extraordinary. Just to give you one idea, the information given by President Maduro to the National Assembly a few days ago in su Memoria y Cuenta, his State of the Union speech, he mentioned that Venezuela now is 97% self-sufficient on food. Venezuela is exporting not only oil, it's exporting a huge number of it, exporting seafood, exporting chocolate. At one point, Venezuela had no coffee whatsoever, zero. Now Venezuela has 400 types of coffee, and they're exporting loads of stuff. I think this is going to definitely strengthen much more, but also even more important in terms of this economic recovery. Venezuela was able to actually economically recover by linking up with various international players, which is extremely important and has been central, a vanguard player in the building of a multipolar world. And if you take these two together, that is to say, the success, against sustained imperialist aggression by a socialist government that is able to mobilize these people and is able to persuade these people to resist to the degree that the Venezuelans have resisted, give you an idea. Let me tell you how I see this. I think, in my view, it's more than 100,000 deaths. I think it's 150,000. Pinochet in Chile took 17 years to assassinate 5,000. That gives you an idea of the size of the aggression and the impact of the aggression and the impact, the brutal, punishment that the population was subjected to. It was equivalent to throwing bombs on the place. If you think about it, you cannot just kill in 3 or 4 years, 150,000 people. And who died? The most vulnerable. Women, pregnant women, people with chronic diseases and so on. So to be able to recover from all of that, coming out economically and politically strengthened, is extraordinary. So it seems to me that from that point of view, the United States, all of them, I don't want to make a distinction between the Democrats and the Republicans, because these they share totally. They have a view that they have to destroy the Venezuelan revolution. I'll come back to that point in a second. And this was voiced already in an article by a guy called Bret Stephens, who wrote a New York Times article on the 14th of January, 4 days after Maduro was actually inaugurated, with the incredible title, Depose Maduro. And I wrote this article with my fantastic compa, Roger Harris, and we put it together and sent it off and process it And I'm posting the reply, our reply to the article in the chat for people to have it if they haven't read it. But it seems to me that that view from Bret Stephens reflects really what the United States would like to do, US imperialism needs to do. I think they have an objective necessity to destroy the Bolivarian Revolution. This is not just about deposing the government of the Bolivarian government or the government of Maduro. This is about the precondition being deposing President Maduro in a violent overthrow in order to reverse completely, totally destroy. This is really the intention. To totally destroy, reverse all the gains that people have made in 25 years and dismantle brutally, absolutely every institution of the Bolivarian state. And I think we know this because during the time of George W. Bush, Colin Powell wrote a document which was about 452 pages long, where he made it clear that the way to democratize Cuba was by dismantling absolutely every single, they didn't use the word, communist institution that had been built by the Cuban state, starting from the Communist Party, going through all the arms institutions and everything else that was part of the Cuban state, the Cuban revolutionary state. So I don't think there is no difference that they would like to do in the case of Venezuela. So this is important in two senses. Number one, to have that successful challenge in their own backyard is intolerable from their point of view because it's contagious. The fact that the Bolivarian Revolution is able to successfully resist sends a clear message to others to say, do not capitulate, do not accommodate, resist. It can be done. It pays off. So, and there is plenty of, political resources, social forces in Latin America, whatever problems there are temporarily in this or the other country, in order for us to be able to actually, for other countries to imitate this. So that's one key reason why the United States need to do. The second reason is in Latin America, you have huge amount of resources, not only Venezuelan oil, the largest reserves in the country, in the world, but you have everything else. You have lithium, you have water, you have copper, you have iron, you have just about anything the US imperialism needs. As everybody knows, it takes between 40 to 45 days for the oil coming from the Middle East to arrive to the United States. It takes only 4 days if the oil is shipped from Venezuela. If you are the United States and you're thinking the way they think, you're thinking, why on earth are we going to accept that this pesky obstacle called the Bolivarian government is going to actually complicate our necessity to actually come to this? I'll finish now, Alan. Do not worry. And the final point I want to make is this. It's very brief. This fits perfectly or okay with the massive, vigorous activity of the Southern Command in Latin America in the last period. Establishing military bases absolutely everywhere it can. There is one in Essequibo, in Guyana. There is one now in Ecuador. There are 10 in Colombia. There are in Bahamas. There are in Argentina, and so on. And in fact, Laura Richardson was voicing what the United States needed, which was, we cannot allow, and this is the third reason why the United States cannot do it, is we cannot allow our enemies, China, Russia, and others, to come in and interfere with investment, money, and so on in what is our territory. And therefore, there is a total objective necessity to do this. Whether they will be able to do it will depend, on the one hand, on the capacity of Venezuela to show that they can resist, and I think they have it. And secondly, on international solidarity. And this is where it's crucial that we redouble or treble, quadruple our effort, because defending the Bolivarian Revolution means defending Latin America and means defending the building of a multipolar world, which is going to be much better, as they say in London, than the one we have now. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. That was fantastic. Particularly pleased to hear that Venezuela is exporting chocolate, because when I was working at the Greater London Authority for the Mayor of London, we had a team building exercise, which was organized by our neoliberal, chief economist. And she decided we should all work together as a team and we should learn to make chocolate. And she took us to a shop which was dedicated to making chocolate things. And it's fantastic. Chocolate goes everywhere, right? But it was Venezuelan chocolate. So neoliberalism can be pierced by quality and by the resistance of the people. And so solidarity can now express itself in this very simple way. Go out and buy Venezuelan chocolate. And the other thing you can do is more mundane, which is try to help all the organizations that took part in this by volunteering to support them, by giving money. It's not a small amount compared with the sacrifices that have been made by the peoples that we've been discussing. It's a small thing to do, contribute a small amount monthly to the organization of your choice. I'm going to post in the chat the donate button for IMG, but there are other co-sponsor organizations. Look them up, support them, donate to them. So I just make that simple point. And also in the chat, Francisco has posted the article that they did in response to the New York Times. I've posted the 2 previous webinars that we organized. Now, I would say I don't know of any way that we can put this chat into the YouTube chat. So go look now, copy those links and refer to them, because they're currently ephemeral. Now, I now have great pleasure in asking Arnold August to join us. Now, Arnold has an MA in political science from McGill, and he completed 2 years of PhD studies in the same field. He's based in Montreal, and he specializes in geopolitics and international relations, the global south, multipolarity, Latin America, and ALBA, Venezuela and Cuba. He also focuses on Palestine, indigenous peoples, China, BRICS, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. He has visited Venezuela 5 times, including for the presidential elections as an international observer, and written over 40 articles on Venezuela. One of his 2013 book in English and Spanish, the section on Venezuela is very valid, and I have a link to his website, which I'm also going to post in the chat. So it's with great pleasure I ask Arnold to join us. Thank you, Arnold.
Thank you very much, Alan, for that kind introduction. Congratulations to all of the organizers of this great webinar. It's an honor for me to be one of the speakers to be present here today. I'm going to deal with 4 points to try to keep it within 10 minutes or so. The first point is reporting back from Venezuela. I've been to Venezuela, I think it was the 6th time a short while ago, but always for a period of not more than 2 weeks, which is relatively small. So when I go to Venezuela, I have started this tradition back in July of 2024 of meeting with Venezuelans who are on the ground, who live there, and who analyze and exchange ideas with them. This started, for example, with the Orinoco Tribune, for example, with Jesus, as well as Venezuela Analysis, and also Misión Verdad. Now, coming out of these discussions back in July and in January, the issue of fraud in the elections always comes up. We have no choice. We have to deal with it. Francisco is right. But, what I'm going to do, I translated an article by Misión Verdad in English. I will be sending the attachment, a very short article, which, sort of breaks it down, similar to what Francisco said. Now, in addition to that, fraud, I say, the situation has changed. Anyone claiming fraud, that Maduro is not the legitimate president, they have a problem now. Because 3 or 4 days ago, the New York Times called for an invasion of Venezuela. The day after, Marco Rubio also called for an invasion of Venezuela. And the day after that, Trump's special envoy, Granell, met with Trump. And the day after that, which is yesterday, Friday, he was in Caracas shaking hands with Maduro. Now, I don't want to exaggerate it, but the fact is this happened, and I think it's a big defeat for the opposition. Guaido had a hard time. He had to delete a previous tweet in which he called Maduro a dictator. So they're doing damage control, and the State Department is trying to undo that whole thing by saying the only reason he went to Venezuela because there's no there's no Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. I don't think that is the case. We should not exaggerate it, but I think what Maduro said about that is very right. Yesterday evening, he said at least first that we defended our right to sovereignty. We made it clear if you want to have good relations with Venezuela, you have to respect our constitution, which means respect Maduro as the elected president of Venezuela. And thirdly, he said, I think this is very significant, we have now opened direct channels between Caracas and Washington, D.C., which in my view is significant because it's a way, perhaps, I don't want to be overly optimistic, it is perhaps a way to overcome the pressure of the deep state, Marco Rubio, to go back to the very violent attack by the United States against Venezuela. But time will tell. But, Trump is a wild card. But I think this is a very positive thing that took place in Caracas the other day. And I think that it, more than anything, shows that the issue of fraud in elections, I think we have to put that aside. It's no longer to be considered an important point. Now, my second point, eyewitness report, January 9th. I was there when the opposing demonstrations took place. On the one hand, by the the opposition, Edmundo Garcia and Machado. It was very clear they were very small, tiny, we're talking about hundreds of people, very small, tiny demonstrations that took place. At the same time, that same day, myself and others who were there were able to participate in the huge tens and tens of thousands of Chavistas demonstrating, including in well-off areas, who support the process in Venezuela and allow the January 10th swearing-in ceremony to take place. There's another point I would like to mention with regards to the controversy of opposition and Chavistas on January 9th, and that is, it's not spoken enough about, perhaps enough, that there are opposition forces in Venezuela who do not support Machado and González. In fact, I read their tweets, and I even spoke to them on the street. They have a very sharp criticism of Machado, accusing them of all kinds of things, including attempt to incite violence in Venezuela. And they also said yesterday, we support we ran against Maduro, but we support the fact that he is the legitimate president. This is not insignificant. And that's why U.S. and its allies never talk about this opposition. They only have their opposition. And this is another proof that they are what is going on. And this same opposition yesterday, in supporting Maduro as the rightful president, also said that they will participate as an opposition in the upcoming local elections, which are scheduled to take place in April. That is, elections for the governors of each state, as well as the elections of the legislative assembly of each state, as well as the National Assembly members of parliament. Very significant. I think this is another indication of the protagonist democracy that has been developing since Chavez won the elections in 1998. Now, the third point.
I'm sorry, Arnold, you're muted.
How long is it going on?
About 30 seconds.
Okay, so the third point I'll be dealing with is Maduro. I've been to Venezuela several times. I've heard him speak several times. But I heard him once again directly on January 9th and January 10th. It's really impressive. This former bus driver who has withstood all of the attacks, including assassination attempts, is so clear and sincere and deep in his analysis of his own country. Every time he speaks, he goes into the history of Venezuela, from the first indigenous uprisings against the Spanish to the rising of the Afro-Venezuelans against the Spanish, and of course those who have followed in this path. Now, one has to take into account the sincerity of Maduro. There's no doubt about it. He is really an important personality that has taken, it says a peaceful transition from Chavez to Maduro. And I think that this is very significant. Now, when he spoke on January 9th and 10th, we know that there were several presidents from Latin America who took, very, we could say, opportunistic stance regarding the Maduro election back July, even challenging it on very similar grounds as the State Department that was fraud and all that. But when he spoke on January 9th and January 10th, he did not mention any of these, what I would call middle of the roaders, to be polite. Rather, what he did mention was the patriotic, traditional fighters in each of these countries, whether it's in Brazil, Colombia, etc., and the role that they have played in history, and showing this is the example that these countries and Latin America have to show as they go forward. So I think, in addition to everything else, he's an extremely good diplomat, which is not an easy thing to do under the conditions. The fourth and last point, I'll be dealing with, I think, very important. I read a fantastic piece a few months ago by En-Fu Cheng, who was a very well-known Chinese international Marxist scholar. I think many of you from IMG and Friends of Socialist China are aware of his work. It was fascinating. He dealt with 500 years, 5 centuries of the development of socialism from the beginning to now. And towards the end, it was an interview, the person who interviewed him asked, well, what do you think about the current situation in other countries? And he made some very important remarks. He said he visited several countries. The theme of the interview was this. It was a socialist planned economy and socialist market economy, right? Very controversial, very profound, and very important. What he said, he visited Vietnam, he visited Laos, he visited DPRK, and he said they're on this path as well. And then there are countries that he did not visit, but he did mention Venezuela and Chavez and the 21st century socialism. So my basic conclusion is the organizers had a very good idea, having as a title of this seminar, Defending the Bolivarian Revolution. And I'm sort of building on what Francisco Domingo said. We have to defend the Bolivarian Revolution because, in my view, this is my view, it is a very important example of how it's developing its economy by mixing planned socialist and planned market economy. And I think this is one of the reasons that the United States is determined to overthrow Maduro because of this example. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Arnold, especially for reinforcing the point that was made in our 2 previous webinars about the great fraud that is being perpetuated to the effect that this was an allegedly undemocratic election. And I still see allegedly liberal commentators just printing without proof, as if it were gospel truth, that the elections were wrong and were suspect and so on. It demonstrates the extent at which the Goebbels principle of repeat a lie often enough and the people will believe it holds. And what we're doing is very important in laying that to rest. I'm also very pleased you raised this very recent meeting between Trump's Envoy for Special Operations, Richard Grenell, an interesting title. I wonder if there is some tension between dispatching Rubio to Panama and Grenell to do the real business of talking to Maduro, but that's something maybe that will come up in Q&A. Now, our last speaker, last but not least, is Fiona Sim, and she is co-founder and organizer of the Black Liberation Alliance, an organization founded in 2020 to build anti-imperialist unity of African, Asian, Arab and Caribbean communities in Britain and beyond. She's currently based in London, and she is a member of the Friends of Socialist China Britain Committee and has written for CGTM, the Morning Star, and several other outlets. So a big welcome to Fiona, our last speaker.
Excuse me, Alan, I don't know if she's here. Is she here? Is she Fiona? Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Sorry, I hope you can see. Can you see and hear me all right? That's okay.
Yes.
Brilliant. Amazing. Thank you so much for having me, and I do apologize for coming in a little bit later. It's kind of relevant to my speech later on, actually, but I've just come from the anti-fascist rally that's been held in central London today against how should we say, some masses of Tommy Robinson fans, followers, supporters who have decided to congregate in Whitehall. They tried to come and rally in front of Downing Street today, but there was a huge sort of anti-fascist counter demonstration. I believe there are about like 5,000 people in attendance from all sorts of trade unions, religious organizations, anti-racist, anti-fascist organizations. And it was a really sort of like powerful event that, you know, even in the cold months of winter, people are still sort of like turning out on the streets in anti-fascist demonstration. And I guess it sort of links quite nicely to the fact that, so as Francisco mentioned earlier, there was a delegation that went to Venezuela with VSC earlier in January. I was really, really honored to have been part of that delegation. And we came for the World Anti-Fascist Festival and in Caracas. And it turned out to be the festival came out of the first International Anti-Fascist Congresses held in November of 2024 in the sort of autumn time. So there was the very first one happened in September, and I was fortunate enough to go to the Youth Congress for anti-fascists in November, and then there was a second follow-up as well. And it was just it's just been an incredible experience to be able to go to Venezuela sort of twice in the past couple of months and really sort of experience and see how organizing anti-fascism and the anti-fascist movement really should be. And it's proven to be such an amazing inspiration as well to myself as an organizer here in Britain. And it's really been sort of like a motivating factor to sort of keep going and keep pushing ahead, even despite, you know, all the travesties and dismal things going on and happening in the world right now. But more on, I guess, the festival in Venezuela itself. So it was a really sort of vibrant sort of coming together of 2,000, I think it was over 2,000 delegates from 125 countries in January who came for the inauguration, who came for the sort of events that were sort of like sandwiching it, which formed the World Anti-Fascist Festival. And it was really important, I think, that Venezuela has inaugurated itself as the anti-fascist epicenter of the world. It couldn't come at a more important time, especially when the Black populations of the world are sort of seated on the tectonic plates of imperialism, where, you know, the Black populations of the world, and I use Black in the political sense, in the terms of including African, Asian, Arab, Caribbean, and indigenous peoples, in the political Black sense. And, you know, all these people from all these countries, they are currently holding their breaths, you know, to see what on earth the imperialists going to do next. What is Donald Trump going to do next? What are the Malays of the world going to do next? What on earth is Keir Starmer, the leader of the apparent Labour Party, going to do? And as we have seen, obviously, in Palestine, we can't, whether a government proclaims itself to be more progressive or more leftist or more rightist, especially in the West, it doesn't necessarily always become or lead to anti-imperialist policies, to multilateral and peaceful policies. And as we can see, Britain's sort of attitudes towards Venezuela, especially during the inauguration sort of time. I still remember standing, I think it was outside the presidential palace where on the day of the inauguration of President Maduro. And it was really interesting because you just had this sea of people from all walks of life from all around the world, including indigenous Venezuelans, indigenous peoples from Panama, from Guatemala, from Honduras, Peru, all around the world and all across Latin America. And then my phone just pings and it says BBC, the UK has decided to put XYZ sanctions on all these individuals and essentially the US has put a bounty on Maduro's head, or has increased the bounty on Maduro's head. And just to have that juxtaposition of the imperialist desperation at a time that was full of so much joy, of so much community, solidarity, and unity against imperialism, against fascism and colonialism in Venezuela, in sort of like what is now the anti-fascist epicenter of the world. It just sort of sharpened the contradictions of where we need to be focused as a left and where we need to be mobilizing our not just our interests, but also our resources in combating disinformation and combating some of the more egregious sort of policies being led by our so-called leaders here in the British government. And I think one important thing as well that should be stressed is that the importance of bringing all these people from all around the world to Venezuela, there's nothing quite like it, because you're bringing people from Africa, from Asia, and who are also fighting for their sovereignty. You're bringing people from Palestine, you're bringing Palestinians studying in Cuba, all the way to Caracas to share in this monumentous sort of occasion. But it's also an opportunity, and it was an opportunity for all of us to network and to learn from each other, to learn about all the different anti-imperialist struggles going on. For example, in the Sahel, we met with so many comrades from Burkina Faso, from Niger, from Mali, who were hand in hand with Venezuela, but also, struggling against the imperialist forces who are trying to leverage ECOWAS into toppling the sort of people-led popular coups, popular movements that have led to the overthrow of French imperialism in the region. So connecting those struggles on a very literally on the ground sort of level is such an incredibly interesting and fascinating place to be, because you're not just learning from someone over a screen, although obviously webinars like this are incredible, but there's something about getting to break bread with people, getting to have dinner with people and learning about their struggles, but also learning about how resilient they are in the face of imperialism. And I think Venezuela is just such an incredible example of resilience. And the youth, I cannot talk about enough, the youth, just the energy, the spirit, the commitment of the young people there. And it's a real inspiration, I think, not just to myself, as I guess I'm still a young person for now, but to just the movement over here and how much we can learn from the vibrancy and tenacity in the face of the most horrific sanctions that are causing a lot of suffering, that are not helping with, things like poverty and exacerbating already very fragile living situations and economic sort of downturns. And I think in the heart of empire, we all know that British school children don't really learn about the anti-colonial revolutionaries, whether it's Toussaint or Ho Chi Minh or Patrice Lumumba. They all go unacknowledged. So it's not any surprise really that if you were to say the name Simon Bolivar to anyone in Britain, would anyone even know who that is? Would anyone even be able to speak on the Bolivarian Revolution? The answer is most likely absolutely not. In fact, the only things they've probably heard about the Bolivarian Revolution are the disinformation that is being spread through mainstream media outlets like the BBC, like, CNN, and obviously on platforms like X and TikTok. Venezuela has had a significant problem with disinformation being spread through social media, being spread through quick, 10-second, 30-second videos that give out all these impressions of Venezuela as this oppressive place run by a dictatorship, and that all that migrants are invading, that this and that, very similar to the rhetoric being heard by actually Tommy Robinson and Nigel Farage and Donald Trump. But in Venezuela, when we were there, we learned a lot about how the youth are really trying to mobilize to combat that by trying to beat them at their own game. So not by turning away from TikTok. In fact, one of the things that the youth are really encouraging the president to do is to promote people and get people to sort of produce more content and to defeat the disinformation by producing legitimate information. And I think that's, again, where the importance of Venezuela and the importance of defending Venezuela comes in, because they're really honing in on the idea of world internationalist solidarity, bringing us together as a global community to defeat fascism, to defeat colonialism and racism and all of the relevant sort of forms of oppression that aren't just affecting Venezuelans, but affecting indigenous Latin Americans, that are affecting Africans across the world, Asians across the world. We've all seen how the disinformation campaigns targeting China have really exacerbated the emergence of the new Cold War. And with Donald Trump threatening tariffs on Mexico, Brazil, China, anyone who associates themselves with BRICS, now is the time that we really need to be unified and in solidarity and to come together, because this, if anything, is the key time to challenge and maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, but to topple US hegemony. Because the US is scared of all of us coming together. It's scared of the Black populations of the world organizing and realizing we can overthrow our imperialist masters, that we can believe in a better world that is possible, that is led by the peoples, whether it's the Chavistas, the Sandinistas, the comrades in China who have been who've celebrated very recently the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, or even, you know, in the Sahel states who are all emerging and trying to figure out how they're going to establish their place in the world as sovereign states and how to become more self-reliant and less reliant on the forces of the West. Because as we all know, the West simply cannot be trusted. And I just feel so elated to have been part of these events in Venezuela, in Caracas, and being able to speak to the Venezuelan youth and talk to them about their politics and how sort of optimistic they were. There was just so much emotion at the inauguration. When we watched the swearing-in ceremony, we were all in a hotel huddled around this little television in the reception area. And when I tell you that people were sobbing, like people were so emotional, because this came after months and months of, you know, of uncertainty, of tension, of an incredibly violent summer. So when we were talking to them, we asked them, you know, can we get a message from you to our comrades back in Britain? And they were like, yes, of course. And they gave, you know, these 2-minute impassioned videos talking about how they've, you know, fought incredibly hard to get to where they are, to even get people into Caracas to Venezuela, to get to the point where they could watch the rightful president become inaugurated in. It was a huge struggle, and they don't take that for granted. And they wanted us, one of the key messages was that they didn't want us to take it for granted here, especially in the West, that just because we're comfortable now doesn't mean we'll be comfortable tomorrow. Just because the fascists haven't, quote unquote, won today, it doesn't mean they won't win tomorrow. We have to be there, out on the streets, out in, you know, in our workplaces, in our trade unions, struggling with one another every single day, and every single sort of waking hour. And of course, we can't ignore the very tenacious force of racism and how it's utilized to divide us, to divide, you know, even to divide the Venezuelan people, to divide the indigenous Venezuelans and Afro-Venezuelans from the sort of white population, from the, you know, the settler population from when the Spanish first colonized. And so it's these divisions, coupled with, of course, class being the primary sort of contradiction here, that we really need to hone in on here in Britain. And we must take inspiration from the Bolivarian Revolution if we are to have our own successful sort of revolutionary processes. So I think that's the key message I just really wanted to get across to everybody today, is that there's so much inspiration to take from Venezuela. And as much as we should be learning from them, and just out of interest, just out of our knowledge, but we should also be learning from Venezuela to learn how to apply their revolutionary struggle to our specific situation, and what connections we can make with the peoples, with our neighbors, not just next door to us, or not just, you know, in the communist group or communist party or study group that we're in, but with our comrades all around the world who are all fighting their own struggles, but whose struggles, when we bring them together, we can win the world. We can build another world. So comrades, my message is another world is possible, and Venezuela is the clearest example of that right now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, first of all, to all our previous speakers for holding to their 10 minutes, because how could I possibly have stopped Fiona? And so that was absolutely wonderful. And we now have plenty of time for questions. I'm aiming, just so people know, to sort of wrap this up, you know, in about 30 minutes time. What would help me is if, as well as using the normal method of putting your hand up, you posted questions in the chat. And in fact, I have 2 questions already from Kim Koo, which I'm just looking forward to repeat. I'm going to put those 2 questions to the panel. And I'll add one of my own. That makes 3. And then the panel, if you could just put your hands up when I've read out the questions, if you want to respond, and I'll just take you in the order that I see you, or maybe in the order that I think is relevant, depending on the question. So Kim has asked first, is there any resolution of the dispute between Venezuela and Guyana? She's also asked, does anyone know whether Venezuela will reapply for BRICS membership this year? And you may recall that the application was blocked by Brazil. I've had a number of discussions with Brazilian comrades when I was in Brazil a month or 2 ago, and it's obvious that there is enormous conservative pressure on Lula. I now think it would not be correct to blame Lula for this, which is one of the things I believed. But I think the issue of whether Venezuela will reapply is going to be very key to the future of Latin America. So that's the second question. And then the third question I've been dying to ask, what do you guys think Richard Grenell and Nicolás Maduro said to each other? So panel, anybody who wants to speak, and I can see Francisco has his hand up. So over to you, Francisco.
I think Jesus was first, and I prefer to come after him.
Thank you, Francisco. Thank you. Well, in relation to the territorial dispute on the Essequibo territory, I just have to say that the most important thing that has to be said about the status of the dispute is that Guyana has broken everything that was agreed on the Argyle Declaration signed by President Maduro and President Ali from Guyana in December 2023. So since almost the very first, I mean, just a few days after the signing of that agreement, a British military vessel was docked in Guyana. So that's a clear indication of how Guyana has been used and has been, how itself has allowed to be used by imperial powers to play, a role in destabilizing Venezuela, and at the same time allowing ExxonMobil to exploit and control its own country. So I believe that that's the status. Several visits from U.S. Southcom operatives and high commanders in Guyana, constant declarations. The latest one was by Marco Rubio a few days ago, supporting Guyana and its alleged rights over the Essequibo territory, which is a big lie because Venezuela is a country that have the deeds on that territory, despite the fact that it is controlled by Guyana. No one denies that. But it's a complex issue. But Venezuela have the right to exercise all the diplomatic and sovereign rights to claim its rights over that territory. And one of the most important things that will happen soon, actually on April 27, when we will have the governor's elections and the parliamentary elections, is that we will have the elections for the first time in history of the governor of Guayana Esequiba, which, is the approach that Venezuela took after that referendum in 2023, in which a vastly overwhelming majority of Venezuelans expressed their support to the claims of Venezuela against Guyana on the rights that we have over that territory. A lot of people in the north, especially Compass in the Afro movement, believe that Venezuela has imperialist dreams or whatever against Guyana, and that's a big lie. Venezuela never has and never will have, especially under Chavismo, any imperialist dreams over anything. Venezuela has been a country that respects sovereignty among everything. But we have the right to claim our rights over that territory, and we are trying to exercise that right peacefully, without military intervention, without sending troops. But anyway, I want to make it short. So that's what I can say about that. The second question was about BRICS and Brazil, and I believe Venezuela has been very careful not to blame President Lula on that decision about, of Brazil somehow boycotting the entry of Venezuela into BRICS last October in Kazan, Russia. But in a few months, I believe that it's going to be in June or July, there will be another important BRICS meeting in Brazil. And many are expecting, at least many socialists, revolutionary, anti-imperialist people in the continent are expecting that maybe Brazil might rectify his position on the entry of Venezuela into BRICS. Who knows what will happen? You never know. But of course, we Chavistas hope that we will formally be accepted at some point as part of BRICS, and I say formally because I believe that de facto we are already part of BRICS. So so we just need the certificate that proves. So that of course is important, and I hope that eventually that will happen. I hope that meeting in Brazil in June or July might help open the path towards that goal. And the last question was about Grenell and Maduro, and I believe that it's complex. No one's, I believe, have to claim victory with anything that comes from Washington and the White House, but I believe it's a slap in the face. The most important thing is that it is a slap in the face against fascist right-wingers, those right-wingers in Washington, those hawks in Washington, and those far-right politicians in Venezuela that play the tune that is, that comes from the White House, and because many of them, as I already said, we're having wet dreams about a military intervention and in the relaunching of the maximum pressure campaign against Venezuela. And the arrival of Grenell to Caracas shows the contrary, shows that Trump is taking more realpolitik approaches towards the relations with Venezuela. And that's, I believe, is a victory, but one have to take it, with, I don't know how you say it in English, with caution.
With a bucket of salt.
Exactly. So I believe that it's important what happened, and I let Francisco keep going with the answers.
Over to you, Francisco, and then I have Arnold.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think there is going to be a solution to the Essequibo issue for a while. And I think the reason is the United States realizes that it's already having de facto a client regime, a client government in Guyana. They are lending themselves to every imaginable provocation, economically, politically, and militarily. And the important thing from the point of view of Venezuela, as I understand it, I'm not privy to any information, and if I were, I wouldn't tell you anyway. But I think what Venezuela is trying to do is, at the same time that it maintains the diplomatic effort to insist that they are the owners of the thing and they want a peaceful solution through negotiation on the basis of the Geneva Agreement in 1966, they are absolutely careful not to fall into any of the provocations, which is what the United States really wants. If you were to look at Venezuela with the prism of the military bases that surrounds it, you will have a clear idea of what the United States is trying to do, certainly that part of it, which is the military bases in Colombia, the military bases, and the military maneuvers and the presence of military presence of the US in Guyana, plus in every other place, Florida in the north, and then several in Central America. They could go boom in 1 second. I think, therefore, the problem for Venezuela is how to maintain the demand that this is resolved politically and through the Geneva Agreement of 1966. What we don't have anymore, which we used to have in 2023, was that Brazil was playing a central role in brokering an agreement that was signed by Guyana and Venezuela that they will refuse to use force to resolve the problem. And the Geneva's 1966 agreement was the basic framework. That was the statement that came out at the time, which was very calming. But that Brazil now has seems to have different priorities. Hopefully they will be temporary. And the left in Latin America suffers some setbacks, which is not, I don't think they will be willing, all of them, as a consensus, to actually come together to sort of push the two countries in question in the territorial dispute to actually progress on that agreement. So that's number one. So therefore, we have to be very patient, be very careful, make sure that the UK and the United States do not engage in provocation. We should denounce every single thing that they do of theirs. That's number one. The answer to the question is whether Venezuela will insist on being part of the BRICS is absolute yes, with capital letters. I do not know exactly. I don't want to speculate, rather, exactly why Lula took the position he took. But I know the following things. 2 weeks ago, Brazil welcomed the Venezuelan ambassador. And therefore, that was a clear indication. And also, Brazil sent a representative to the inauguration of Nicolás Maduro. And then, a couple of days ago, I just saw it a couple of days ago, an interview by a very good activist, Breno Ullman, a Brazilian, who interviewed President Maduro. And when he asked him specifically about this, Maduro said, as far as I'm concerned, the issue is over. We don't have an issue anymore with Brazil. That's what he meant. And he said, well, literally, objectively, in every possible sense, we are part of BRICS anyway, so there's nothing to worry about. That's more or less was his response. On the last point, I think it's quite important, I'm not saying that anybody is, but I've seen some articles, people who shoot from the hip before looking at the situation objectively. Some people believe that Trump doesn't want any wars, and he sort of wants to pacify things, and he wants to be friends with Putin and God knows what. Maybe that there are tactics involved there on the part of Donald Trump. But objectively, from the point of view of the necessities of imperialism, it is not possible to draw too many conclusions about this. The United States remains committed to destroy the Bolivarian Revolution. And this is a tactical moment. And I know that, any tactical moment, any dialogue, any possibility, any opening that the United States offer will be taken by Cuba, Venezuela, and anybody else. I'm absolutely guaranteed. But we should not read too much on it, even though we should welcome it, because it's a small step, a baby step in the right direction. Let's hope that this is able to develop. One argument which is important to find out rather than to assert it is whether Trump is being compelled to talk to Maduro directly, because otherwise there is not going to be oil. And the East Coast of the United States needs desperately the oil from Venezuela, which are buying already anyway. So that's as far as we'll go. And, the statement from the foreign ministry in Venezuela is very clear. They talk about everything else, immigration, trade, blah, blah, blah. Hopefully that will continue, but I'm not holding my breath.
Arnold and then Maria.
Hello. Yeah, on the issue of Venezuela and BRICS, just to build on Francisco's very good analysis, I also believe that it's all over. Venezuela is definitely going to join BRICS at the next major session. And just to give some background information to solidify my opinion, is that when Lula made that unfortunate veto, irrespective of one's opinion of it, there was an immediate backlash. In Russia itself, where the meeting was taking place, Maduro, of course, true to the tradition of Chavista, spoke very clearly against the Brazilian veto. In addition, the host of that meeting in Russia, President Putin, made a very, I think a lot of people underestimate Putin as a very important international diplomatic figure. What did he say in Russia after the Brazilian veto? He ridiculed those who did not recognize the Maduro victory. He said, well, anyone could go in any public square in the world and say, oh, I'm the Pope of the Vatican. Oh, I'm the president of Venezuela. So he just sort of put that to rest. And in addition to that, there were many other statements. For example, China, since that time, has not said anything against Brazil, but China has increased its relations, its comments in support of Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela. So I think it's all over. And I think that what really will help the situation is not to overestimate it, but the fact that Grenell, as Trump's envoy, went to Caracas and shook hands with Maduro that day, that is definitely going to help those in Brazil who are pushing for a inclusion, full inclusion of Brazil in BRICS. The situation has changed radically. Now, on the other thing, so I think they definitely will be included in the next meeting. On the issue of what happened between Grenell and Maduro, very interesting thing. I watched that very closely. The Telesur's main reporter, Madeleine Garcia, who was I think she was the only person from the news that was allowed in that closed meeting in the presidential palace between President Maduro and Trump's envoy. We saw a picture there of, first of all, Maduro, it's important to note, was accompanied by who? Jorge Rodriguez, who was head of the National Assembly and also responsible for negotiations between the Maduro government and the opposition. So he was there. And there's one picture which shows him laughing after Maduro said something to Trump's envoy. We don't know what he said, but there was some kind of a chemistry being formed there, whether it's sincere or not on the part of the United States. The other thing you asked, like what was actually said, from the side of Venezuela, to be quite concrete, they put out a communique. I'm just going to quote a very short excerpt from the original Spanish. And that, first of all, the main point, and I think it was brilliant on the part of Maduro, he mentioned to the envoy, these negotiations are starting from zero, agenda zero, in the sense that we didn't get anywhere so far. Let us discuss. And I think that this is what took place. They discussed, and the Venezuela side, according to their communique, they put emphasis on, yes, they recognize there's the issue of immigration, illegal immigration in the United States, but also on the issue of the territorial integrity of Venezuela that has to be respected in any discussions with the United States, as well as the question of the importance of maintaining open channels of diplomacy between Caracas and Washington, D.C. And they said that according to the communique, both sides agreed to start a new path with regards to relationship between the two countries. I emphasize again the open channels for the first time, because Biden never did it, between Caracas and Washington, D.C. How far that will go, we don't know, because on the other hand, one has to know what the United States say after he left Caracas with the 6 prisoners that were released by Maduro. By the way, Maduro said, we released the 6. That's the first step. Now it's up to you, because a lot of people in the social media are saying, Well, now that we released those 6, the United States should release Guaido to Caracas so he could be punished, or at least face justice in Caracas for everything he has done. Now, in the airplane going from Caracas to Washington, D.C., there was a short gaggle, I guess, in which there's a photograph of Grenell and the 6 prisoners, in which it was reported that each of the 6 prisoners profusely thanked Trump for freeing them from Venezuela. So at the same time, the State Department is busy doing damage control, saying that, we still recognize González. So I think it's a positive step, but we have to watch this very carefully. But I think one should not underestimate the diplomatic know-how and capacity of the Maduro government in dealing with the United States of America.
Maria.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Arnold, and thank you, Francisco. Excellent, your excellent insights into this. I'm going to, wade in with my own opinions. First of all, Trump is a man who only is interested in those things that benefit him personally and politically. So we're not thinking of a man who has very much strategy and thinking of broader things. So there are several things that have happened here. One is that it is a break from Mario Rubio. Mario Rubio is a contender. He is a contestant to the presidency. This is a man who has insulted Trump many, many times, called him all sorts of things. And so what Trump has done is given him quite a plum, which makes him very close to him. He's keeping his enemy close. And with this special envoy, the special czar, he has sidelined Marco Rubio and sent him off to El Salvador. This is very good. Second of all, this meeting is a wonderful slap in the face, as one of you has said, to the extreme opposition in Venezuela, particularly Edmundo González and La Machado, okay? Because this is something that they did not want and indeed lobbied against. And third of all, it is a great win for the oil producers of Texas and Louisiana. They have been holding a strong lobby for a long time against the sanctions for Venezuela, particularly Chevron. They do not want to leave Venezuela. They want to carry on obtaining the oil from Venezuela, buying it, and they know that these sanctions are a huge mistake, both in terms of their politically and in terms of the money, because the Venezuelan oil is right next door, and it is more than that. The refineries of Texas and Louisiana were built years ago specifically to refine Venezuelan oil, the specific type of Venezuelan oil. They can't change that overnight. They can't bring oil from anywhere else without huge processing cost against it. So they desperately want this. This was a great win for them. They were the ones that pushed for this meeting of Granville. So it's not that I think that, all of a sudden Pollyanna, everything's going to be great. But this is a good situation because there is a communication between them, as Arnold August has just said. This is so much better. The second thing that I want to say is, who is the man that he's still fighting against? Trump is still fighting against Biden. So he wants, just like he did before, he wanted to destroy everything that Obama did. Now, Trump wanted to destroy everything that Biden did. And so he is against this policy towards Venezuela that was identified with Biden. And also, he did not like that he got a pie in the face by Guaido and Machado, because these two swindled him and his government. And this is a man who likes money and wants to figure out where the money went. And right now, they're going to sue those two for the monies that disappeared, particularly the monies that disappeared that were given to them through USAID. So Trump has no reason to be nice to Guaido or to be nice to La Machado. But more importantly, he can't be that stupid to fall into backing yet another false president, Edmundo González. So I don't think that no matter what Marco Rubio says, Trump hasn't said it. As to the Essequibo, well, folks, this is a very tricky situation. It undoubtedly, historically, the land belongs to Venezuela. But the big mistake was that it was administered by Guyana. Now, Guyana is a miserable country that has treated its people miserably. It is one of the poorest countries, and you can't compare the type of benefits and social services that a Venezuelan has compared to what a Guyanese was. So here is my humble opinion. We can't go in there and invade. Venezuela would never do that anyway, and we would lose. But take an example from Russia and what they did with the Donbass. I would push for a referendum for the people of Essequibo, so the people of Essequibo should decide where they want to live. And if this is done, how could I say, without any shenanigans, where the people of Essequibo are told, if you become Venezuelan, these are the things that are to you. If you remain with Guyana, these are the things for you. We might have a referendum where the people of Guyana can decide which country they want to adhere to. The thing I do want to say to you, there's been a lot of talk about, oh, you know, the United States can invade Venezuela and Syria, and they can do this and that and the other. Well, Venezuela isn't Syria. This is not the Middle East. This is right in their back porch, if you like, as they say it. And surely, I don't believe too much in the politicians, but I do believe a bit in the American army. And they've got people graduated from West Point. And if you're graduated from West Point, you would have had to study what tactics means and what strategies mean. And they would have to know that if the United States invades, through ever base Venezuela, they will get a regional war like Vietnam, because it will be a very bad way for them to win it with you have a population against the invader. And not only that, you've got a whole world of people who would go to Venezuela to defend Venezuela, starting with the Cubans have already said it, and the Chinese. But you see, people would not come to back maybe Bashir, maybe Hussein, these people who weren't particularly democratic. But Maduro, as Fiona has said, is quite a person that has drawn all kinds of international backing of leftists and people who are anti-fascist. And the minute you have an American soldier stepping into Venezuela, you will have not only countries, but also individuals coming for the benefit of Venezuela. And we will have a regional war, which will be a very terrible thing. And we should avoid that and do everything possible so that this doesn't happen. But they cannot walk in and take Venezuela without this regional disastrous war. And the last thing about the BRICS, yeah, I think Venezuela is de facto a member of Brazil. Russia and China were appalled at what Brazil did. Almost immediately, they made all sorts of accords and deals with Venezuela as soon as they were allowed. And I am not a diplomat. I don't belong to any government. I don't belong to the Venezuelan government. So I'm not a diplomat. I can say what I like. And I will tell you that Lula was terrible. He committed a terrible betrayal. I don't care if he fell and hit his head. What happened was something that someone who supposedly is a leftist, who supposedly backs the people, what he did was unforgivable, and it won't be forgiven. People will remember what he allowed to happen to Venezuela, because I tell you, this was a big blow to Venezuela, not to enter the BRICS. The United States does not want Venezuela in the BRICS. Have no illusion about that, because Venezuela in the BRICS would make it tremendously powerful. The biggest reserve of oil would then be with the BRICS. So the Americans don't want this. So I think that what, I hate to say this, but I think that Lula was got to. He was either he was an idiot and he allowed a junior official to take the decision, or somebody got to him and said, you must say no to this. So I personally think that Lula made a horrendous blunder that he will have to live with, but not Maduro, because Maduro, as Arnold has said, is a fantastic diplomat. And he has done everything not to antagonize Brazil, because after all, the people of Brazil, so many of them are on our side, and he doesn't want that, and he wants the goodwill, and he wants them to change their mind. But I think the people who are left and progressive won't forget Lula's betrayal. And in the end, I just want to say, I remain very much a revolutionary. And if you're a revolutionary, you cannot be pessimistic, because if we're pessimistic, well, stay at home and read a good book and go to the movies. If you're a revolutionary, if you believe in this new world and our values of humanistic, new world, then you've got to be optimistic. And I am optimistic. I think Venezuela's on the right road, and vamos a vencer, venceremos, I'm really convinced of that. Thank you very much.
I think we'll all agree that's a magnificent note to end on. I just want to make a couple of observations. One, we're often told that before you can do anything useful, you have to be an academic with a great degree and a great string of publications, or if you're in the Trump camp, you're told you have to make, a minimum of 1 billion on real estate before you qualify. Well, let's not forget, Chavez was a poor soldier and Maduro was a bus driver. Let's not forget that. So anybody can do it. What you need is courage and conviction. And I hope that this has added to the conviction of those participating. I have one thing to say about Guyana. Let's not forget Walter Rodney. And what happened to Walter, well, Guyana is not a miserable country. It's produced some of the most wonderful people that I have known. I was actually taught general relativity in the University College London by Randronas Capildeo, who was fled as a member of the opposition of Guyana and taught mathematics. And how many opposition leaders do you know who can teach general relativity? But he was, he started life as a militant, right? And Walter Rodney, who is one of the, the finest leaders that Latin America has produced, and this has produced many, he was killed. He was assassinated in 1980. So what happened to Guyana is not that it was a poor country or a miserable or a bad country, but that it was defeated. That's what happened to Guyana. And so Venezuela will not be defeated. Venezuela will not become another Maduro will not become another Walter Rodney, and we're going to help and make sure that we stop it. That's what we're here for. So thank you all the speakers for your wonderful contributions. Thank you for all the participants for attending. Stay strong and keep and spread the word. Thank you very much, and I'm going to end the meeting.
Now, Paul, can I end the meeting and still have the recording? Okay.